I suppose that Jerry Geisler was going to charge me 100 grand, as he did others. On the contrary, his fee was only $30,000. It cost, of course, another 20,000 for expenses. Subsequently, I saw him from time to time. In my ledger, a wonderful person in my ledger, a wonderful person and one of the great attorneys. He claimed that of all the witnesses he had, I made the best. What he meant by that, I still can't figure out. Maybe he meant I made the most skillful liar under oath? There was a sequel to my costs of the defense. Jack Warner loaned me 50,000 at 6 cents per interest. So it cost me more money in the end. I never got back the cost of the trial. I had to pay back that 50,000 plus the interest. Ostensibly, I won the case. The people had vindicated me. There was applause for the verdict, and the crowds thronged into the theaters to see my pictures and get a double laugh, to laugh at the film fair, and to enjoy seeing the man who gave them so much entertainment over and beyond the call of picture making. A new legend was born, and new terms went into the national idiom. A GI or Marine or sailor went out at night sparking, and the next day he reported to his cronies, who asked him how he made out, and the fellow said, with a sly grin, "I'm in like Flynn." I picked up some letters that I had written to my father from New Guinea many years earlier. I had asked him to send me a few of those letters. I wanted to look back at what I was in the lonely jungle. I wanted to look back at what I was in the lonely jungle of the deep Pacific and compare myself with what I was now and see which figure I liked better. At that time, I wanted so much to live. In October of 1931, I wrote to him from Leiloki Tobacco Plantation, where I had just built a furnace and concrete firebox inside a tobacco curing barn. I thought I built this very well, and I said, "This one is all right, though, and should still be here in 200 years' time, barring earthquakes. It is a depressing thought to consider that at the end of that period of time I shall most probably not be here to enjoy the fruits of this labor." At that time, I regretted I couldn't be around 200 years later. That was how interested I was in living. But now, sitting around Mulholland, those first thoughts of death, destruction, and suicide began to occur within me, which would not early or easily or perhaps even vanish. I no longer had such an interest in living. I didn't give a damn, in fact. Much of the will to live had gone. In a way, I had conquered the forces of life, rather young. I had fame, fortune, and nature had given me a unique physique. I had even luck. I had everything, ostensibly. And yet, I knew I had lost. I knew that I could never escape this brand that was now upon me, that I would always be associated in the public mind with an internationally followed rape case. Next section just has question marks. After the trial, I found myself relatively ostracized locally. I was thrown on my own resources again. I slid back to where I was years before at Leiloki. I pulled out the books. I closed the doors at night. I brightened the reading lamp, and I plunged into history again. I reread Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I decided the Roman Empire had stood for a long time. Maybe I would too, after all this died down. While I wasn't treated as a leper, uncertainty prevailed as to what would happen with my career. I didn't know then that the congenital disease of America is that Americans buy success and almost nothing else. I put on a house party. I thought I ought to start living again, seeing people, find out who my friends were. I did. Mulholland House was located with flowers, liquor, lights. I invited just about everybody in the community to come to my house for an evening of fun. I invited all the big shot producers, stars, directors, and writers. Along about the middle of the evening, I realized practically nobody was coming. A handful of people showed, perhaps a half dozen. Ori Kelly went around the house laughing to beat his head off, slapping his thigh and saying, "Stella Dallas had a party. Nobody came to the party." When he said that for about the sixth time and split laughing each time, I called up a studio where they had beautiful models. I had them round up about 40 and rush them over. They blew in, the prettiest mob of young ladies you ever saw. They drank and mingled with the few guests. I got roaring drunk, while Ori's words kept going through my mind. Stella Dallas had a party. Nobody came to the party. I had tried a social comeback too blasted soon. The thing had to be done in the American way. I had to have a picture that was a big success. I had to make with the box office in a huge way before my Hollywood friends would recognize me again. Okay, do it their way. That is exactly what happened. My place had always been an open house to my pals. They came around, as loyal as ever, and party life resumed on an even bigger scale at Mulholland. I did take some precautions, putting in several devices at the approaches to my place. If somebody stepped through the gate uninvited, all of a sudden 15 floodlights would shoot on. The guy would be like a frozen steer wondering what the hell he'd stepped into. If a lady checked in, she was requested by a neatly printed notice on the door to have her birth certificate. Ladies, kindly be prepared to produce your birth certificate and driver's license and any other identification marks. One of my pals scrawled after that, preferably on your thigh. Sometimes I saw Nora Eddington, but it was, so far, a sporadic romance. I was pretty damned careful to check Nora's age. I had dark intents, but she was a withholding type. While I believed I would be an object of scorn and derision, it didn't turn out to be that way at all. On the contrary, the whole country seemed to get amused out of it. I expected to be an object of ridicule, but the opposite surprisingly happened. My box office appeal went up, and with one or two box office successes, I was completely restored in the Hollywood community. But it now had a rampant character. Public appearances were absolute hell. I would sweat a week before I agreed to open a Red Cross drive. You couldn't easily turn down requests such as these. You were bombarded with such demands. Very, very mandatory. Preemptory demands appear here, there. And if you had been 6 people, you couldn't get to all the places they said you must be. Before each of these events, I would get a hollow feeling in my stomach. I didn't know what I would say, what I would do a week in advance. When you showed up, you were manhandled. You might have 6 cops protecting you, and you and the cops would get overwhelmed. At one event in South America, people broke barriers. The police and I found ourselves trampled upon, so that I wished I was in something relatively mild like a Mike Curtis production. My suit was torn to shreds. It got so I never wore a handkerchief. One lost that in an instant. At Fort Myers, Texas, where I appeared for a polio benefit, I was met by a howling mob. President Roosevelt was there, and others of importance. I felt I was some kind of interloper, the way I was stealing their thunder, without intending to do so. They rammed at me, pulling my ears, trying to kiss me, men and women both. My pockets looted or torn, or my shoelaces pulled off and my shoes removed. Everybody wanting a souvenir. A mob hysteria that made it hard for me to keep my dignity. All the time I wondered, why? Because I had made some pictures? Because I was freed of a rape charge? What the hell kind of national heroes do they have in this country? The worst thing one could try to do was run from such a mob. Then I got tripped. Once, when I was tripped and was trying to get up, I wished wholeheartedly I could sink back into the obscurity from which I never should have emerged. I believed that in my heart. It was all very well to see naked Ubangs in Africa, or the Aitape headhunters of New Guinea doing strange dances, letting out shrill cries, patting themselves on the arse. But who would expect to see such demonstrations in the big cities of America? There was very little difference in the human behavior. The screeches, the howls. It made me wonder whether we have progressed very far from the so-called primitives when I saw such manifestations of mass hysteria. In one way, it was flattering, yet I had the feeling there were scientists, idealists, even politicians who did more for society than I had done. Why was this adulation falling to me? Didn't they know what I thought of myself? Every dog has his day. I had mine. I came in, I think, just at the point where the mass hysteria, the curiosa Americana about movie stars as public figures had already become part of the national folklore. Gable, Cagney, Raft, Barbara Stanwyck, Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, Spencer Tracy, a number of others. A new court of St. James off Catalina Island, Duke Wayne, the Earl of Grant, Lord Cooper, the Marquis of Cagney. We replaced Jesse James and the Dalton brothers in the national affections. Behind all this, there was a fellow inside of myself who would say to me, "You're an imposter, Flynn. In real life, you don't do any of the things you do on the screen. You're no more capable of that kind of action in real life than a choir boy." Maybe that is why, in my private life, I went ahead, consciously or unconsciously, to live such a life of reality instead of portraying it all the time. All I know is this is a different world than it was before the cinema. Before that time, I would have stayed forever a bum, and the people who now are deposed monarchs and ex-kings and ex-princesses, they are often the bums today, and I have been living the kingly life. One day, I called my valet. "Alexandre," I said, "I want you to put this monogram on each of my suits underneath the handkerchief pocket." "Why?" he asked. "That's a good question," I said. "Why?" "That is what I want to know, and I can't find out why. So I want this monogram sewed onto all of my suits." I had drawn a squarish question mark, thus. This, my own confusion, became my trademark, my own questioning of myself. Why? How does a man become what he becomes? Who does he become? I do not know. I didn't know then, but it pressed on my thinking so much that I felt I must carry the symbolism to gratify my own curiosity or torment, or to make people think. I still wear a question mark beneath my handkerchief pocket on all of my suits. I'm still wondering why. I was now fair game. Weird letters came to Mulholland claiming I was the father of this child or that. I used to get one very embarrassing letter from a place I never heard of called Little Falls. The lady would give me the news of little Errol, how he was getting along. "Why don't you acknowledge him? He looks so much like you." I had never been in Little Falls, and I had never dawdled with anyone who hailed from there. I started to keep a file of blackmail letters, threats, accusations, claims, knocks. I never read the fan mail telling me how much they loved me or how great I was, but these knock and blackmail letters were funny. Now the stack is 3 feet deep. About 6 months after the rape case, 2 elderly people came to my business manager and said I was the father of their grandchild. My manager said the child was a cute little girl. "These people are going to be a nuisance. Why don't you take a look at the kid?" His advice was about the worst I could get, but I was curious, so I went down to his office. 2 elderly, apparently sincere people presented a small child. The business manager said, "All they want you to do is to take a look. If it's yours, they know you'll do right." All they wanted was $1,750 a week. I walked around the exhibit. I knew there could be no resemblance to myself in the little girl except that she had 2 arms and 2 legs. But you never know. It was explained to me that I had taken the girl home in an open car, but with the top down at the time, and a dog in the back seat. She lived at the corner of a crowded Hollywood boulevard. There, in the front seat, at this busy intersection, I had had relations with her. I said to myself, I'm lucky if I do not wind up with the national title, Hardway Flynn. The studio heard of this. I was persuaded, so as to avoid bad publicity, to settle this nuisance for about $2,000 or $3,000. But on my honor, I'm too large a man for any front seat of even a 1959 model, and this was back in the mid-1940s. A particularly good pal of mine is Hedda Hopper, the famous columnist. But our friendship was not cemented until the night I gave Hedda a good swift kick in the pants in public, and I think I may well claim to be the only one in my profession to have done so. Maybe you have to give somebody a kick in the pants sometimes to gain a friend. Whatever the immoral, this happened when I was taking Nora about and hadn't yet married her. Hedda printed something about Nora which hurt. I can't remember what it was, but I phoned her immediately. Hedda said, Hello, dear. That dear stuff fouls up the whole entertainment profession. Dear, darling, dearie. The knife is never far behind these 3 Ds. Listen, you bitch. What do you mean by saying such and such? I protested. You know damn well it isn't true. You should have checked your facts. Keep in your head, honey. Hedda laughed. That maddened me more. It must have hit home, eh? I'm going to sue you. She laughed even louder. I couldn't think of anything nicer. If you do, I might get syndicated even wider. That was true. Okay, kid, I said. There's only one thing for me. The next time I see you, look out. I'm going to kick you right in your fat prat. It wasn't fat, I might add. I was dancing with Nora at the Mocambo a few days later. Nora pointed to a woman behind her who, she said, was laughing at her. That did it. I went over to Hedda and her partner, and when Hetty's rear was turned, gave her a good one just where I promised. She let out a shrill sound, and her hat flew into the air. She looked surprised. I said, You see, honey, I told you I would. Hedda's humor never fails her, but for once it took a bit of time. Had it been anybody else with less of a good nature than she has, I'd never have taken the chance. A few months after the trial, Nora and I were married, and my first daughter, Deidre, was born on January 10th, 1945. I got Nora a house in Hollywood. There she lived her life, and I lived mine at Mulholland. This was the only way I would be married to anybody. Separate houses, separate lives, separate people. I had a life to live, pictures to make. Desperate Journey, Northern Pursuit, Uncertain Glory, San Antonio, Never Say Goodbye, Escape Me Never, Cry Wolf. The career went ahead. With better or worse stories. Mostly I walked through my pictures. I had my dissatisfactions with the vehicles, but I had huge expenses now that had to be met. I had to keep working. Occasionally, I would have Nora up to Mulholland for a weekend. She swiftly picked up the Hollywood ways. She learned to pal out with the screen people, go to the right places. She no longer talked like a Hollywood high school girl. She had learned to roll with the punch that had rocked her from obscurity into the circle of so-called Hollywood society. I hired Nora's stepmother, Marge Eddington, a lovely bird-like little woman, to oversee Mulholland House. Marge spent much of her time there while Nora stayed in her own house. Candidly, life with the Eddingtons, Nora and her stepmother, provided no pattern for the human race on which to model itself in any effort towards fashioning the perfect home. One day, I asked Ann Sheridan on the lot what she was drinking. It looked like tomato juice. It was, but it had vodka in it. I took up vodka drinking. Vodka has no odor. Nobody need know you have had it. That's the theory. A Of course, alcoholism is one of the slowest, though most certain forms of suicide. I still retained my looks, but avoided looking at myself in the mirror. I knew what I looked like. I had no vanity about my face, my build, my features. I even became disdainful of this, my stock in trade. Inside, I was smarting, terribly wounded from the scar of the rape trial. I knew now I would never get over it. Perhaps this was, in part, because the press began to take a fantastic interest in me, in everything I did, and they were always looking for a certain type of story, strictly sex. I wanted to report any and all activity and relationship I had with women. It seemed to think it a wonderful and colorful copy. The boys and girls had been good to me in the rape case, damned good, so I decided to roll with the punch. Never meet the press unless there's something sexy to offer along with the drinks, and learn to laugh at yourself first. I was in New York, accompanied by Freddie. While there I was on a radio show. There is always a group of fans outside waiting to get your autograph or say hello. As we came out, Freddie and I noticed an unusually good-looking redhead. I returned to my hotel, and this redhead was already there with an autograph book. She had a charming smile, and besides, she was outside my apartment. When you're pursued that much, give in. I invited her in. I hired her as a nurse secretary and sent her to a nearby shop to buy a smart white uniform. On one side of her white cap was embroidered the word nurse, and on the other, secretary. I decided to have her about to provide color, so that nobody would be disappointed. This was absolutely platonic, and she had no duties outside of upsetting my friends. Her job, when people were about, was simply to walk up to me wearing the nurse hat and take my pulse, put her lovely red head down by my breast and listen. Put her lovely red head down by my breast and listen. Then make notes. All this to be done deadpan while I watched the expression on the faces of my friends. Freddie had her services when he took a bath. Her job was to scrub his back. He loved a bubble bath and always had a small rubber toy duck floating in it. Sadly, this design for living broke up when the girl's boyfriend came to the apartment and raised much smoke, demanding that his fiancée get out of this impossible situation with two such characters. And this ended the nurse-secretary deal. The press watched me like hawks to find out who I was going with next and what the shenanigans would be. I fell into a pattern of obliging them. There was a press conference at Mulholland. This time, I meant to regal the lads and lasses of the Fourth Estate. I was now definitely going along on the line. If I've got the name, then give me the fame. While the boys asked me questions, I nonchalantly sat on a settee talking deadpan. Freddie was in the room. Two beautiful young twins, in their early 20s, walked into the room stark naked. The boys stared. The reporters pivoted their heads about as the naked girls walked chatting together from one room into another, as if nothing was happening at all, as if they were here because they were part of the Flynn retinue. Actually, I didn't know these girls at all. They were models hired to do just this once. "What the hell is this, Flynn? A gag?" one of the reporters asked. "Gag? Hell. These are just a couple of my girls, ready at a minute's notice." The girls casually walked into the room again and went on into another room, not even looking at the reporters. These boys looked stymied, though I think they realized later I was satirizing. Smarting under the growing legend of myself as blood brother to the god Phallus, I didn't let on. I smiled more broadly. I gave a good performance as the guy who just doesn't give a damn.